You are listening to Designing the 21st Century. I'm a long admirer of the work of architecture firm Sawyer Berson. Why? Because I can see myself living in each house that they made. Each apartment, each interior, and every garden. The homes, whether modernist, federal, or traditional, are always so airy, beautiful, chic, and inviting. They're dazzling in their elegance, and they make your heart drop because Sawyer Berson have mastered all fields of architecture. The homes are thoroughly researched, beautifully executed, and meticulously furnished to the smallest details, with landscapes that are simply divine. They have famously created homes for the stars, but it is lesser known that they have also built community gardens for Bette Midler New York Restoration Project and the kitchen garden for the God's Love We Deliver, which provides meals for the needy. Brian Sawyer, co-founder of the firm, is my guest today. He received his Master of Landscape Architecture from the University of Virginia and worked with the Central Park Conservancy in restoration projects before joining Robert A.M. Stern, rising to the head of the Landscape Architecture Department. Hi, Brian. How are you?
Good, Daniela. How are you? Nice to see you.
I know. I invited you because I read this book and just magical homes, just so beautiful. And I want to ask you, you grew up in Indiana?
Yes, that's true. That's
and you
exactly
studied music?
I did. I studied music and biology and botany at Wabash College.
Did you know that many architects started with studying music? Did you know?
A few of my colleagues have, but I ask people, I remember, always to ask people what they studied in college, because oftentimes it's not what you think it was. Like some people would have studied, well, if it wasn't music, maybe philosophy or art history or even politics or things that are adjacent to architecture but really have nothing to do with it specifically. And I think people have more richer pasts than they will tell you. So it's always good to ask.
You started your career with Central Park, and when you talk about architects or designers or furniture designers, it's very well known that knowing history is really important to construct a vision. Is it the same with landscape architecture?
It's incredibly helpful, and I think since I was a child, I always looked at things. I could see, whether it was a building, a house, a garden, a landscape, and I have a nearly photographic, graphic memory, where I can remember things as a child through my adulthood that are just locked in my memory. So for me, history and recalling history is fairly easy. And the more I read over the years and the more I gather and store in my head, you compile really a historic point of view, whether you like it or not. So everything in our firm, our designs generally get filtered through this vantage point of a historical awareness, whether it's a landscape or a house. And I find it adds to the layers and the creativity level of a project, and I think the depth and also the sophistication of it. I think it's unless you kind of have an eye for history and can recognize it, you can often make a mistake.
What makes Central Park the most celebrated park in the world?
Well, I think it's the distillation of American landscape architecture. It's the crowning achievement, really, in American landscape architecture. It took all the lessons of urban design, romantic garden design, classic garden design that were fundamentally developed in Europe, as we all know, from the mid 16th century through the 19th century, when Frederick Law Olmsted began his design. And it's amazing compilation. Maybe that's not even a fair term, but it's really a compilation in a way that his understanding of those precedents and how he applied it to a very difficult design context and political context in the city of New York is remarkable. There probably won't be anything like it in the future as far as its level of achievement. I think everything else in the United States, a lot of it is a beautiful echo of that. And beautiful parks now being designed in New York are still, they all have a foot in that design, you know, between Central Park and also those in Brooklyn and throughout the United States.
So, what is the most seminal trip that you've made that became your inspiration as a landscape architect?
Well, I think for me, it was my first visit to Italy and to Tuscany and to the Renaissance gardens that I studied so carefully in Shepard and Jellicoe's book, Renaissance Gardens of Italy, and reading Edith Wharton and all these basically early 20th century documentaries or documentations of those gardens. And I finally made it.
So that was memorable.
That was actually indelible for me. And
Wow.
seeing, you know, for very obvious reasons, seeing and being in those spaces you had seen in books and fantasized about and copied in drawings, all of a sudden it comes to life. So that was that was far and away the most important trip for me.
You know, your firm is known for building houses in many different styles. How do you choose the style? Does this have to do with the client?
It does. We always feel it's a mixture between the client and the context. So oftentimes, like the modern houses are the ones that appear on the ocean or in contexts where the landscape or the view is overwhelmingly, important, or something that a modern house can only truly take advantage of. And so that's but really it's the personality of the client. They will come to you and say, I like this, what you did, or I like this house over in this place or that one. And they will say, what their style is or what they think it is. And then it's your job to really find out what's the kernel of truth in what they're telling you, what is really in their heart. And sometimes people will switch. Not so much as switch, but develop an idea. They think they are looking for something particular, whether it's modern or traditional, but it's really not. It's something else that I think can make it even more interesting in the design process.
So you are an educator.
Yes, you have to assume that position.
Yes.
You're a negotiator, an educator.
And everything else. And everything. And psychologist.
Leader,
right.
Psychologist.
When you build a lot in the Hamptons.
We do.
And there is a certain belief around the architectural community that when people build shingle-style houses, and I know you started your career with Robert A.M. Stern, but when they build shingle houses, that they don't have a vision, that they don't have any real inspiring taste. What do you think about that?
I think that's not all that fair. In general, I think that there's a reason to take on shingle style and those materials and those influences that really are the very powerful local vernacular. I think the challenge is to turn it into something that's unique and beautiful for that client, and not create a joke out of it. There's something. If you take a deep dive into that style and what people and a lot of firms are doing today, you'll see rich interpretations of it and skillful manipulations of the style. And people sometimes don't quite see what they're looking at sometimes. So I think it's fair. The client, a good client who understands that, will say, I want this traditional, I want this look, I want this style, I want shingle style, but make it unique. And it actually is, in a lot of ways, more difficult than a modern. Because you have to, I think, have even a better respect for historical precedent and what's happening today, and make it something special.
There was time, and tell me whether it changed, that it was known that if you had a shingle house style, you sort of were very safe in terms of the real estate investment. Is that still the case?
Uh, it is to a large extent. I think it is the case. But I do find that in our experience, in our first house, our first modern house, sold for quite a hefty sum. It was on the ocean. The point being that it still stands today and is viewed as a very valuable asset as a modern house. And I think that's more and more true. I think that there was in the 60s and 70s a lot of very high quality design happening, but not so much in terms of the quality of the construction. So you'll see precedents from the 60s and 70s that really recollect modern houses such as Fire Island and other things on the East Coast that weren't built to last. Now you're seeing a commitment to quality in the modern houses that makes them, I think, much more powerful and enduring. And I feel proud that we've been sort of part of that,
Wow.
creating, I think, a better context for those houses to feel valuable and enduring in terms of
That's
style
really
and fashion.
interesting. Now your gardens. Are you responsible for the landscape in the office?
Yes, I design. I'm director of design for most everything. So
Your
one day I'm doing a
gardens.
garden, one day I'm doing a house, the next day I'm doing an apartment. So it's a
You
thrill to work on gardens, and we're actually doing more and more of it. I have a group of 6 landscape architects, and together we.
Your gardens are just breathtaking. How do you define them in the context of landscape architecture?
Well,
In terms of the style or the direction?
a lot of them, since they're almost always associated with our houses, obviously have a lot to do with that, whatever that house is demanding. So some of them, like the modern houses on the ocean, they really are about making sure this house has a beautiful and viable context on the ocean. And they're not so much about individual gardens as they are about landscape and topography and honoring the place where you are. Other houses have somewhat more articulated gardens that might be more geometric or formal. Those tend to be a way where you may not have a big view. They may have a more introspective position as far as the property, maybe, and you're creating views for the house. So it's fun to work in different styles of the gardens just as it is the house. But generally, as I think about them at the same time as we're developing them, you bring them up in the design process to the same level.
And where do you buy all these plants? Is this like, do you have a specific place?
Well, it depends on the plant, what you're looking for. So right now we're looking for very specific, very specifically pruned pine trees for a garden in the city. And we get those from the West Coast. They often come from Oregon State, Northern California, Washington. That kind of material, when it comes to evergreens, often comes from that part of the country. Otherwise, if we're looking for big trees and hedges, they come from this area generally, from anywhere from northern New York down to the Carolinas. And we're working with a marvelous nursery in Georgia for a project in Atlanta right now. And they're able to provide almost all the material, which is great because it's a local nursery.
One day I'm going to have you designing my garden. I'm like in love
I'd
with
love
the
to.
gardens. I'm in love with it. Now, I want to also talk about yourself. You're a collector, I learned.
Oh, well, unofficially.
What do you collect?
I'm a magpie of collectors. Whatever seems twinkly or beautiful, whether that's a little painting or a glass or drawings or minerals. I collected for a long time taxidermy, which was a little peculiar, but I had a great uncle who was a famous taxidermist, and I learned from him to appreciate what the art was, and it was a fascinating thing for me, honoring my family history. But I like collecting things that for me in my house in Long Island and Bellport, and for my apartment in New York, that bring back memories. And I think a lot of people do that. And I can say, oh, that came from Venice, that came from Rio, that came from Tokyo, and it's just it helps
Of course.
for me, just bring back memories and mark them.
That's why it's so great to live with things that you collect and that are personal and that they are memories. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think with artwork, I focus on artwork from friends. They're painters or sculptors, and I'm surrounded by a lot of that in my apartment, especially. And they have an extra special meaning because you know the person who did it, and those are the things I love the most.
Brian, wow, thank you. Now I learn more about you. We've known each other for a long time, but now after I read this book, I know much more. So thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great pleasure, Daniela, and thank you.
This is Daniela Ohad. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Designing the 21st Century.